Good morning, everyone. Thanks again for coming out. My name is Seth Jansen. I'm an engineer with Brendel Group. I've been working with the ClimateWise program in various capacities for my entire 7 years with Brendel Group. And Brendel Group has been working with Kathy and folks for about 12 years now, I think. So long history with the program, and thanks for the opportunity to come today and chat about some of the things that we see on the horizon for sustainability. Some kind of new things beyond, like Deb said, your day-to-day operations. First, a little bit about Brendel Group. We're a sustainability consulting firm, mostly engineers. We've been around since 1996, serving Colorado, the Rocky Mountain West, and now really we have work going on nationwide in Ohio, near Washington, D.C., Oregon. So we're getting pretty spread out now. About 10 to 15 people on staff. And we provide sustainability services across these areas you see here, kind of management consulting, energy, water, climate, sustainable design for new buildings. And some of our prime sectors are across the bottom here: local government and utilities, K-12 higher ed, ski and tourism, that's my personal favorite, and leading edge companies. We try not to provide commodity sustainability services. So, we do energy assessments. It's a great way to train our staff and to know what's going on in building operations and kind of the day-to-day for the businesses that we're working with. But we're also trying to look forward to the leading edge and kind of stay on that edge. And that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about today, where we see things going with our services. And hopefully that means the markets will go there too. So what I was going to look at today is kind of three topic areas: sustainability in supply chains, sustainability in kind of a regional collaboration model, and sustainability and comprehensive planning. And these aren't really new ideas. They're things that we've seen companies doing for 5, even 10 years, but they're things that are really starting to gain traction for a broader market. I think we see more businesses doing these, some of the sustainability ideas that are in these topic areas today than we have in the past. So I'll start out with a little bit on supply chains. So first, a quiz question for you. If you think about your 6-pack of fat tire, and all the greenhouse gas emissions associated with it, from growing the barley and the fertilizer that goes into that, to transporting that barley, to making the beer here in Fort Collins and bottling it, to shipping it out to the customer and refrigerating it. Does anyone have a guess as to what percentage of the greenhouse gas emissions in that whole cycle actually occur over here at New Belgium? Anyone want to hazard that guess? I heard some 50s, I heard some 5s, some 10s. Those of you who guessed on the low end are right, 5.4%. It's a little bit counterintuitive. I mean, you see this big kind of industrial scale facility over there. They're brewing a ton of beer. They're using energy. And you would think a lot of the emissions would occur at that facility. But it turns out roughly 48% of the emissions are upstream of New Belgium in growing the barley and transporting it and malting it. And about 46% are downstream in distribution and refrigeration at the retail, which is actually the single biggest source of emissions. And the reason I bring this up is that you can be as sustainable as you want in your own operation, but if you're not talking to your suppliers, if you're not working with your supply chain and kind of getting outside your own sandbox, so to speak, you're missing potentially a lot of the environmental impact, the social impact, the broad sustainability impact of your products and services. And so this is one area that we see a lot of activity right now in sustainability, is in businesses working with their supply chains to try to start that conversation about how to make their products more sustainable. So like I said, it's not a new idea. New Belgium actually did this study back in 2008, so they've been thinking about this for a while. But we're starting to see it gain a lot more traction in other industries. We did a webinar a couple of weeks ago with the ski industry on this topic and had Patagonia and Quicksilver, apparel manufacturers, on that call, and they were talking about their experiences with it. And they said, we're not really hearing this from the consumer yet. Consumers aren't saying what's going on in your supply chain. But they are hearing it from their big buyers, like people who put their logos, like a Vail ski area, for example, that puts the logo on their jackets. They want to know where Patagonia is getting those materials and what kind of conditions those jackets are produced under. So we're seeing a lot more interest in what's happening upstream of the product itself. And it goes really beyond environmental sustainability. It's also about risk management, knowing what conditions your supplier is in, what the social conditions are in terms of labor with those suppliers. A good example of that is the recent media kind of blitz over Apple and Foxconn. You know, there are risks in your supply chain if you have people manufacturing equipment and doing it in a way that's not sustainable or using labor practices that you may not approve of. So this really goes beyond just the environmental impact. You know, when we work with our customers, we would still say, focus on your own operations first. That's where you have the greatest influence. That's where you're going to have the greatest control and ability to actually make a change. But I think it's a good time to start talking to your suppliers and thinking about what you might be able to do upstream. So for ClimateWise partners, you know, a lot of us aren't the bigger companies who might have a lot of influence over their supply chain. We're not the Walmarts who can literally dictate their supply chain. So what are the smaller steps that we can take as smaller companies in order to have some influence? And you know, we thought about this in our own office. Being 10 or 12 people, we don't purchase a lot. We don't have a big incoming supply flow. But we do, of all the things that we do purchase, computers are probably the single biggest item with the biggest impact. So we picked off the big item first. We said, what can we do about our computer purchasing? We went out and we looked for a third-party standard that would give us some confidence that the supply chain for that manufacturer was up to snuff, so to speak, in terms of environmental performance, labor performance, and so on. So for computers, we looked at the EPEAT standard, which has a variety of criteria related to the materials, the labor, and the broad sustainability of the product. And so we were able to not exactly exert influence there, but at least have some confidence that what we're buying is the best product that we can. What's that? What was the name of the supplier? It's actually a standard. It's called EPEAT. Oh, okay. And that's for electronic products, and a good one, you know, as a lot of the small businesses here probably do purchase a lot of electronics. And it incorporates Energy Star, so it's not just materials and labor. It also has the performance of the product once you purchase as part of that standard. And so, you know, for smaller companies, looking to a third-party standard is a great way to go. And in general, we would just encourage you to commit to purchasing within a certain standard for those materials or supplies that are significant factors in your business model. Either setting some expectations or looking to a third-party standard that sets expectations for those suppliers, and then, you know, working with the suppliers like a Patagonia or a larger manufacturer might to communicate what you're looking for and to help them measure and build their own capacity to have their own operation be more sustainable. And I would just also mention here that ClimateWise will recognize so basically supply chain projects as reported projects. So if you pick a supplier here in town that's more sustainable than another one, say for your landscaping services, that's something you can report as a ClimateWise project. So I think ClimateWise has done a good job of recognizing the benefits of this kind of sustainability activity. The next thing I'll talk about briefly related to supply chain is it's related to the EPEAT, basically, and it's that there are a lot of third-party standards coming out now, a lot more information available about what's going on in supply chains. This is just an example from it's the Higg Index for apparel. Basically, this is the place where the Patagonias of the world, the Mountain Hardwares can go to find out what the sustainability of the supply chain is for different materials. So they can look up the polyester or the nylon that they're going to use in a piece of apparel and find out more about its life cycle across all these impact areas. And it's an expanding standard, so right now it addresses kind of the three big ones: water, energy, and waste, but they're also getting into broader sustainability topics with that index. And I just provide this as an example. I think there's going to be a lot more standards like this and EPEAT becoming available to help you pick the best products you can for those of us who can't literally exert force over our own supply chain. And I'll credit this slide to Beth Jensen from the Outdoor Industries Association, who's helping to develop the Higg Index. The question was, do I know if there's an index of indexes? And I don't know that there is at this point. I think Google is probably your best index to find sources out there. Like I said, EPEAT's a great one for electronics. I know there's some good ones out there for office products. The next I'll talk about is regional collaboration. We see in the sustainability marketplace, regional collaboration is something that's kind of picking up both as a way to drive innovation, but also as kind of a model for how to achieve sustainability. And so I'll provide kind of two examples. The first is clean tech and the clean tech industry in Colorado. It's over the last few years, clean tech, so renewable energy, clean energy, water technologies, has grown at a rate that's more than twice the rate of the rest of the Colorado economy. And that's partly just the market for these technologies right now. It's growing fast everywhere. The Colorado Clean Energy Cluster and other organizations throughout the state have also worked to kind of develop this ecosystem that's really favorable for innovation and for companies to succeed in this space. And actually, the Innosphere, this very building, as a technology incubator for these kind of companies, is a great example of kind of how this framework can be applied in a very real way. So some of these economic development functions over here at the left, technical assistance, having your local research base like CSU, incubation is literally listed there, networking. These kind of functions help businesses succeed and innovate in this area. And so we're seeing this as a really replicable model across all different kind of technologies related to sustainability. Another kind of interesting parallel to that is I would almost say that the ClimateWise program itself is something of a cluster that provides some of these economic development functions, but not around a sector like clean tech, but around a concept, greenhouse gas reductions and community sustainability. By providing some of those same services, networking, technical assistance, encouraging project development, ClimateWise has grown substantially over the years and really provided a lot of benefit to the community in terms of hundreds of thousands of tons of greenhouse gases avoided, as well as significant cost savings to the partners participating. So I think this is a really good model for regional collaboration, and that's another direction that we see sustainability going in. It doesn't seem like a new thing here because ClimateWise has been around for 12 years, but we literally have communities knocking on, or communities around the country knocking on our door, both Kathy as well as Brendel Group, asking for help to develop this kind of program in their community. So there's a lot of desire to replicate this around the country. And the last topic then that I'll talk about is kind of comprehensive sustainability planning. And historically, there's been a big focus on energy planning by businesses. It's been a big focus area because that's where you see the biggest bang for the buck in your bills. It's something that businesses tend to be more aware of. And by extension, planning related to climate, so looking at the kind of projects you can do over the long term to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. What we're seeing now is a trend toward more comprehensive sustainability planning that recognizes not just energy and climate, but also water in particular in this region, as well as other topics. But I'm going to talk a little bit about water in particular today. It's long been recognized that there's a really strong relationship between water and energy. Most of our electricity production in this country relies on water. It's either hydroelectric, so it's literally energy being produced from water, or it's thermoelectric, meaning that the power plant has to be cooled by water. And so on average, nationwide, it takes about 2 gallons of water per kilowatt hour of electricity produced. On the flip side, it also takes a lot of energy to produce our water. 3 to 4% of electricity consumption nationwide goes to water treatment and distribution. And so while this kind of system scale relationship has been recognized for a long time, most businesses tend to focus quite a bit on energy. They don't think as much about water, and they're not really thinking at all necessarily about how these things interact at a system level. So we're seeing planning moving toward recognizing those system level interfaces and being more comprehensive where businesses are starting to address water. And we can think of a lot of the reasons why that's becoming a bigger interest with even the weather patterns that we've seen in the last few years, and the lack of snow until today being a good example of why that priority is increasing. How many of you are familiar with the concept of a net zero energy building? Has everyone kind of heard of that? Okay. The idea being that a building can basically generate as much energy as it uses over the course of a year. So we're pushing a new kind of similar concept for water, the net zero water building, where the goal is really to recognize how much water does a particular site have access to, how much rainfall occurs at a particular site, and is the business operation that's taking place on that site operating within the limits of the amount of rainfall that that site might receive, and what can be done to try to drive water use toward what the ecology, so to speak, of that site would allow. So this concept is based on some work that's being done by the Water Footprinting Network. So this idea of looking at, it's kind of like your supply chain or a life cycle impact that we talked about earlier for the beer, but in terms of water instead of greenhouse gases. And then planning to reduce that impact both in quantity and quality through some of these strategies that you see here, reducing water use through efficiency and conservation. That's kind of the traditional one that we're all familiar with. Low flow fixtures, making sure water faucets get turned off, getting rid of leaks, that sort of thing. But also some other ideas about on-site capture, reducing impervious area, and then even trading credits in water. And I'll get to those. I'll talk about that more in a second. So this is kind of a conceptual planning idea where, you know, in some parts of the country that is legal and it's a viable strategy. Here we can look at what the potential would be, but yeah, not currently legal. So the idea is to both influence potentially policy around that and finding ways that it could be made a viable strategy here, or to recognize that it's not and look at the other options that we may have. So yeah, it's kind of a twofold thing. And the way, this is still very conceptual at this point, and the way that we're looking at it is as what could be both a paper exercise, so kind of a way to get us to think more about how we use water, what our opportunities are, and maybe kind of separated from the actual water law and what's legal in a particular place. And then there may be places where you can actually literally achieve net zero water on a site where you literally collect the water that's falling there and that's all that you need over the course of a year. So it really depends. Yeah, so we're currently doing pilots for at a number of scales here at the community scale. So looking at how this could apply to a whole community. So you could almost think of that as being the watershed scale. We're also applying it at the campus scale. So we did it for a higher education institution in Kentucky where water law is very different and rainwater capture is an option for them. And we're doing it at the individual site scale. So we've done it for our building, and I'll share that example with you here in a second. And considering different localities as well where water law is different. Yeah, so it's kind of a conceptual idea at this point, and to really explore the possibilities and potentially to drive policy, we would hope. You know, we would like to see some of those policies change in the future. So we look at the water footprint, and this one is for our office actually, in two pieces. So the first one is water quantity. So this is the literal quantity of water that we're consuming at the site. And the second one will be in terms of water quality, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And the way it breaks down for our site is 60% of our total footprint is literal water consumption on site, so water quantity. You can see that's a little over 80,000 gallons per year right now at our site. That includes indoor and outdoor. So indoor use for faucets, the dishwasher, you know, traditional small office stuff, and then outdoor for the landscaping. I know, totally separate from carbon now, just talking our literal water footprint. So how much water do we consume? And then the flip side of that is water quality. How much water would it take to dilute our stormwater pollutants down to the EPA allowable levels? So we want that number to be lower water footprint. So we're using less and we're putting less of a load on the stream and the stormwater system in terms of pollutants. So this is literally what we actually use. This is how much water falls on our site in a low rain year. This is how much falls on our site in an average year. So in an average year, our current consumption could conceivably be net zero on our site if water law allowed for it, if we could capture enough water. And that could either be literal in terms of having big tanks on the site, or it could be conceptual and at least saying our use is at least less than what actually falls on the site. In a bad water year, we use more water than actually falls on our site, and that's even now as a small office. So you can start to kind of see at the office scale, this tells us that maybe we need to reduce our use to start bringing ourselves within the ecological limits of our site. And in a bad year, we need to reduce it pretty significantly. Yeah. So we do have a little bit of extra land beyond just the building. It's basically 2 lots. We're over at Mason and Mulberry, if you ever want to take a look. I don't know the exact square footage of our lot. I want to say 14,000 square feet, but I'm not sure where that number is coming from. It may not even relate to our site. So the question was, how much are we irrigating? We irrigate about half of it. Yeah, we do have a blue grama grass, a native grass that's on the east side of the building, and that's about half of our lot, and that is irrigated. And this being a new, newly remodeled building and newly remodeled landscape, so to speak, we are in the establishment phase still, so we're still trying to get that landscape to take. And so you'll see that's one of our strategies here for getting down to where we are within our use limits, even in a low water year. But to the other question about whether this is a normal case, we're starting out with fairly low flow fixtures since we did a remodel recently. I'd say the density of people in our office is fairly low compared to a normal office, and we do have a xeriscaped landscape to start out with. So we probably do have some advantages in falling at least within the bracket of an average to low water year right now at our site. In terms of the way we looked at it here, because it's treated water that's used to do the irrigation, we don't take any credit for the fact that some of that will return to that, basically be reabsorbed, that it's not going to the wastewater treatment plant. So we're not taking any credit for it on this side. On the water quality side, we do take some credit for landscaped area because it's pervious and it will not produce storm water the same way that a concrete parking area, for example, would. So some of the strategies that we're looking at, over the next 8 years or so to reduce our water footprint in terms of quantity on site are improved efficiency and conservation. There's more that we can do there. We're literally keeping a log of our dishwasher use to make sure that the dishwasher is only using as much water as it was manufacturer said it would. We do get down into those details in our office. As I said, it's a landscape that we're still trying to establish. So this big chunk here is what we're hoping we'll be able to reduce our outdoor water use as that landscape matures and doesn't require water as much anymore. And then potentially, depending on how water law progresses over the next 8 to 10 years, we're hoping that some kind of gray water reuse or rainwater capture may become an option for some of our water uses. But you can see that even kind of conceiving of where we may be able to use that water, we're still anticipating that we would have some gap in terms of net zero water, that we really can't get down any lower than a certain level. Yeah. Right. And in that case, net zero is probably going to be a paper exercise for most sites where you say, here's how much water falls on the site, we're going to use less than that. There probably aren't going to be a lot of places where you can literally capture all that and use it on site. Yeah. Right. And I don't know those answers. Like I said, kind of a conceptual planning tool at this point, but starting to hopefully drive some of these discussions about the practicality and the legality of certain technologies. Yeah. It's more of an issue of subtraction than actually tracking the specific dishwasher itself. So we know pretty well what our other water uses are in the facility, toilets, sinks, those kind of things. We're counting how many times the dishwasher runs in order to see if it makes up the proper difference. It's going to be an estimate. There are some small metering devices, and actually one of our water assessment folks has been looking at those. I can find out more about it if you're interested. Yeah. Yeah, no, we're not. The question was, how do we know what our toilet use is, at least better than the dishwasher anyway? No, we're not putting check marks on the wall, don't worry. And we don't make guests do that either. Now, there's been a number of studies that look at typical office use based on number of occupants, and so we assume we're fairly typical and not using the bathroom more than others. So I'm glad that generated a lot of interest. I'm a little fearful now because the water quality side is actually more confusing than the other side. So thanks for all the good questions. So on the water quality side, this is kind of another example of where I'm talking about kind of comprehensive planning. So this is kind of a neat way to go beyond just thinking about your own direct impacts as a consumer of water, but to think about how you impact the stormwater system and then the water bodies that stormwater flows into. So the EPA and the state of Colorado have some new standards coming out for nitrogen and phosphorus and particulate loading, I think, is the third category in streams and what cities and communities and watersheds will have to meet in terms of those standards. And so we wanted to look at, in terms of the stormwater coming off of our site, how do we contribute to that problem, and how could we also help reduce that problem? So now, instead of the community having to think about how to dilute pollutants in stormwater or to deal with that issue, we can start talking about it at the individual site level. So, when rain falls on our site, some of those pollutants enter that rainwater, and then that water flows off our site and it ends up in the polluter. What can we do on our site to reduce that impact? So basically, this looks at the amount of water that it would take to dilute our impact in terms of the pollutants flowing off our site to the levels that would meet these new standards coming from EPA and state of Colorado. And so you can see that relative to our water consumption, it's a big component. So if we look at the two together, this is 40% of, so it's almost as much as our water consumption that it would take in terms of water to dilute that stream down to the point that the pollutants were where they need to be. So again, we're looking to drive that essentially quality impact down to zero, to where the water coming off our site, what water there is not exacerbating the problem for the city or for the polluter. And some of the strategies that we look at there are reduced impervious area, so that gets to your point about how much are we irrigating and do we take credit for that. We did porous pavers in part of our parking lot, so it's a porous concrete that allows the water to flow down in so it doesn't become stormwater. But there's a pretty good portion of our lot that already had either asphalt or concrete on it, where we could replace that existing surface with porous pavers. So that's something that would potentially have a huge impact on how much stormwater we produce, and therefore what our impact is on the quality of that stormwater. Another option there would be rainwater harvesting, where if we could replace some of the, if we could capture some of that water that would otherwise flow off-site and use it on-site, that's another opportunity to reduce the stormwater. Yeah. And again, so there's a component that we anticipate, even if we took these measures, we wouldn't be able to address. And in both of these charts, my colleague has kind of called it either water quantity credits or water supply credits or water quality credits. And what we're talking about there, and this kind of is a segue into the other sort of emerging topic that we're seeing in sustainability, is you've all heard of carbon credits or renewable energy credits. And basically these are some kind of economic instrument that represents either reduced carbon or generated renewable energy, some environmental benefit, or at least avoided environmental impact somewhere else that you can potentially purchase in a market. So the other area that we're seeing as kind of an emerging sustainability area this year is new markets for different kinds of environmental goods, and what they're calling them is ecosystem services. Carbon credits would fall under this, but we're seeing it being applied more broadly to other topics. So if you think back to our water quantity issue, you can imagine a marketplace where a site that is using less water than falls on it can trade credits to a site that needs more water for whatever their activity might be. And whether that's a literal market where there's a payment transacted, or whether it's a paper market where we just look at the accounting to kind of understand, on a watershed balance, are we using the amount of water that we have, or are we over budget, so to speak? There's different ways to envision that. But the idea behind ecosystem services is that you would actually create marketplaces where some of the benefits that nature provides more generally, like some of these ideas listed here, water purification, so that could almost relate to some of the stormwater stuff we talked about, climate regulation. Some of these strictly ecosystem services could actually benefit businesses and users downstream and be something that potentially becomes part of a market where, if you can enhance the provision of those services, you may actually be able to sell that benefit. And so an example is, and I'll credit these slides to Patrick Flynn, Colorado Conservation Exchange, which is out of the Center for Collaborative Conservation at CSU. They're working on developing the Colorado Conservation Exchange, which would be kind of a pilot marketplace, particularly for water quality credits. So the idea is you've got some kind of natural system, whether that's a forest or ranch land, that's helping to provide clean water, for example, just as an aspect of how that ecosystem functions. If there's something that somebody who's managing that forest or that rangeland can do to help it better do that, whether it's erosion control or planting trees or whatever that activity may be, that can actually improve the water quality benefit of that ecosystem service, then that may be something that somebody downstream would actually be willing to pay for. It may be less expensive than the alternative of treating that water, for example. One really good example of how this can work is after the Hayman fire, Denver Water, instead of had the kind of two options to keep their water supply clean, the parts that were impacted by that fire. They could either build additional treatment, which was expensive, to take all the sediment that was running into their water supplies out, or they could plant a lot of trees to help secure those soils and in the long term to reduce the sediment loading in their supply. So they've invested enormous amounts in reseeding and kind of stabilizing those slopes, and that's been an alternative for them to actually having to build new treatment. And so in that case, they did this fairly directly, but the idea behind ecosystem services is that you could actually build a marketplace where you have a bunch of sellers who are doing things like that may benefit utilities or users downstream in that case, and then a bunch of buyers who are those downstream like breweries or utilities that may want to invest in that kind of water quality benefit. And the question is it similar to cap and trade except for water? And exactly, yeah. The idea is you have kind of a fixed amount of some benefit, or you may even be able to enhance that benefit. You can generate a verifiable credit for that and then potentially fund that downstream. This basically just illustrates the idea I just mentioned related, in this case, to water quality, where you'd have some kind of exchange, which is, as I mentioned, Patrick and the Colorado Conservation Exchange are working to build a pilot around this in northern Colorado right now, where they ensure the production of some quality benefit, and in turn the utility funds them to do that. And then they work with ranchers to actually identify the locations that could provide that benefit and see that it's actually provided. So this is the idea behind ecosystem services, and kind of tying it back to that planning idea. At the end of the day, whether it's energy or carbon or water quality, there's probably going to be some impact that our businesses have that we can't mitigate or reduce. And this is where this kind of exchange could help you look to that broader system to find the benefit that you're looking for, either in a marketplace or at least in some kind of collaboration with other users in your watershed or in your community or whatever it may be. Sure, that's a similar, the question was, is it similar to kind of land conservation easements and setting land aside in return for a payment? And I think it is, that the benefit there, the service there that's being provided, and I guess they're varying, but habitat protection, aesthetic protection of that land. So it's the same idea, yeah, basically there'd be some kind of payment in return for a service, and there'd have to be a way to measure it. So one of the big things about water quality is how do we measure the benefit of, let's say one ranch changes their practices, how do we measure that benefit in a way that we can actually quantify it and say that what we're paying for actually occurred? And that's some of the challenges that Patrick and his team have faced in trying to set this up this year. But again, pretty conceptual. I think it's probably a few years out from seeing wide adoption, but there are a few exchanges that are already functioning. For example, there's one in Montana that's worked to maintain stream flows in a particular river, and one of the buyers there is a brewery that wanted to see that their impact on the water source was not to dry up the local river, and so they are actually buying water quantity credits to be able to keep water in the river as opposed to drying it out. So certainly measurement is an issue, identifying what the credit is, verifying it are all issues, and that's what they'll be working on with this in the next few years. So yeah, in summary, some of the new horizons we're seeing this year in sustainability relate to how we're dealing with our supply chains, how we're dealing with our sector partners and those with similar ideals in the community in terms of regional collaboration, and then really just broader planning. In particular, we're seeing water as a big horizon, but really that kind of planning model can apply to solid waste or any other sustainability topic. And then increasingly, there's a lot of new tools out there for helping you work in some of these areas. So that's what I have for today. Any other questions? So the question is, at what point do you start thinking about your supply chain when you may already have a lot to deal with in your own operations, a lot of opportunity in your own operations? A year ago, I would have said, don't even worry about your supply chain. You know, there's plenty to do in your own operations. Obviously, your most direct economic benefit is going to be there. Your most direct benefit with your consumers or your customers would be there because they're going to see the benefit. And to some extent, I would still say that. Focus on your own operations first. If you're going to get into supply chain, I would suggest picking out those one or two biggest things that you purchase, if that even exists, if there are one or two things. You know, if I were a brewery, I would look at my barley and my water and think about where it's coming from and start talking to those suppliers about ways that they can be more sustainable and help make my product more sustainable. If you're a hospital where you're probably buying a lot of different products from a lot of different people, there may not be that sort of big fish to go after. And I would, yeah, and certainly anything that, you know, simplifies what you have to do from a regulatory perspective or from a waste management perspective, that helps your operation then too. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I would still encourage focusing on your own operations. I think especially for small businesses that won't be able to exert a lot of influence on their supply chain, that makes the most sense. But keep an eye on it, because there will be more tools out there and more opportunity to be pickier about what you're buying in both products and services. Yeah, so the comment was that even if you don't have enough of a market push to really influence the supplier, that even just starting to talk about it gets the idea into their head that, that there's interest in this and they should start thinking about it and working toward a more sustainable product that they're providing. And we heard the same thing from Patagonia and Quicksilver. They're not hearing it yet from their consumers that they need to do this necessarily, but as they're talking to their tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, they're talking about it, and those suppliers are saying, yeah, we're hearing this from everyone who's buying our nylon or our, you know, our drawstring for a hood or whatever it might be. We're starting to hear this, and it's starting to impact the way they provide products to Patagonia. So definitely have heard that, and I think that kind of crowd message that this is something we're all interested in does have an impact. I think that's a great point. Well, thanks a lot again for coming out, and have a good one. Enjoy the snow.